Hello, and thank you for joining. You are watching OBN Horn of Africa. This is weekly program Future Africa, and I am Fantam Belete hosting the program. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Misbahu Saidu, lecturer at the Department of History and Diplomatic Studies at the University of Kashere, Nigeria. Doctor, a very warm welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Would you introduce yourself to our audience, please? Who is Dr. Misbahu?
Well, I'm Dr. Misbahu Saidu. As I rightly said, I teach in the Department of History and Diplomatic Studies, Federal University of Kashere, Gombe State, Northeast Nigeria. So I teach in the department. I specialize in economic history with particular reference to infrastructure and industrialization.
Let me directly go to the first question. Investment is one area Africa has been failing to benefit from. How can this continent tap into investment resource?
Okay, thank you very much for this question. As you rightly said, Africa is lagging behind, particularly when it comes to this area of investment. If you look at economic history of Africa, particularly in the post-independent period, when African countries achieved political independence, mostly in 1960s, there was actually this euphoria of independent economic development. Many African countries embarked on ambitious economic programs in order to engender sustainable development in their respective countries. That's why development plans were actually promulgated by various African countries. The aim was actually to attract investment into their individual countries, and then by generally so as to develop the continent. We all know the impact of colonialism, for example, on the continent, the various changes it brought about, particularly in the economic sector. If you look at it, for example, we have many problems. If you take agriculture, if you take industries, if you take trade and commerce, if you take the service sector, and what have you. So in the decade of 1960s, actually attention of many African countries actually focus on this area of investment, try to attract these investment opportunities and whatever, because Africa, as many scholars have said, is a natural candidate for agricultural development. Africa is a natural candidate for sustainable industrialization because of the potentials, because of enormous resources that the continent is endowed with. If you look at mineral resources, if you look at various parts of Africa, you have gold, you have diamond, you have uranium, you have petroleum, and whatever. So the aim of this successive government actually in Africa, starting from even independence, has been to actually attract this investment. However, as you rightly said, we are yet to even achieve that particular goal because most of our resources are not fully tapped, for example, and then this could be linked to several, many problems, many factors and actors in this regard. First, you talk about issue of even infrastructure, okay? You have this problem in this area. That's why maybe you'll find out that many don't want to invest in the continent. Even though, for example, as at 2021, evidences have shown that the continent attracted about $83 billion in investment flows and what have you. But if you look at the potential, if you juxtapose this with the potential which the continent has, you'll find out that we are not yet there, okay? So many of our investment opportunities are not yet harnessed and what have you. So some of the problems could be linked to, first, you talk about even issue of the politics, do you get the point? Because there is what a tight relationship between politics and economic development in the world and in Africa in particular. So because of the nature of our politics, some scholars say that this actually discourage investment because, for example, some talk about even the Hobbesian character of political struggle in Africa, this issue of political instability and other. So it means politics play a tremendous role when it comes to issue of attracting investment because it is at the political level that decisions are taken, favorable or otherwise, that will attract or discourage investment. So in this regard, it is very important to fix our politics. We have to look at our politics. So the Hobbesian character of political struggle, particularly political instability and other problems associated with our politics, actually discourage investment in this particular sector. And then secondly, closely related to that is the issue of even infrastructure. No investor will want to invest in a place whereby there is this poor infrastructure. So if you look at, for example, the continent of Africa, we have been wrestling with this problem of poor infrastructure since maybe our independence. For example, some scholars have even shown that for us to have, there's this what we call infrastructure gap in Africa. And for us to fill this gap, we need continuous investment of huge amount of money. Some scholars will put it at about more than $90 billion for us to close the infrastructure gap. So issue of infrastructure explain what I mean is one of the reasons why actually we are yet to actually tap our investment, harness our investment potentials. So we have to look at this issue of poor infrastructure, and then if you look at even studies carried out by many scholars, starting from even 1989 by Oscher, in the case of United States of America, he was able to find out that there's this correlation between infrastructure and economic growth, that if you have at least 1% increase in infrastructure stock, that will translate into at least 1% or thereabout increase in your gross domestic product. So it means for us to encourage investment, particularly in the continent, we need to fix our infrastructure deficit. We have to address our infrastructure problems. So again, this partly explains why we have failed actually compared to the potentials we have. We have failed to actually benefit or tap into this particular resource, particularly in investment. So apart from infrastructure, we have other issues like even issue of institutions, okay? Related to even the issue of politics we talk about. If you look at the bureaucracy, the other problems related to our institutions, maybe they are weak and what have you, this contribute immensely towards discouraging investment. Again, you have issue of insecurity. Unfortunately, the label, the dominant news being propagated, particularly in Western media, and some are factual, is that this issue of Africa or Africans living like a chaotic mass of disconnected atoms. For example, you have conflicts everywhere. For example, in the Sudan right now, we're going to maybe examine some of the issues in Sudan. You have crises. If you go to northern Mali, you have issue of this crisis. If you, Nigeria, Northeast particularly, you have issue of Boko Haram insurgency, even though it has subsided right now. And then in Northwest, you have banditry, kidnapping. So generally, if you look at the continent, you have issue of this issue of conflict, insecurity. So this also affects investment. And then you have issue of maybe technical know-how, because for you to invest, particularly this issue of resources endowment we have, for example, you need the technical skill, technical know-how in order to effectively exploit the resources you have. For example, are you talking about uranium, for example, in the Congo? Are you talking about petroleum, crude oil and whatever? So you need technical skills, and then unfortunately it has been observed that this is somehow lacking. So this actually explains some of the reasons why you have poor investment. And then you talk about even the capital itself, because you need this issue of capital on the side of government. Even though you have this debate, for example, particularly in the African continent, the role of government in this, that government should have no business in business and whatever. But the issue is that if you look at it, particularly at the level we are, depending on your peculiarities actually among various countries, but you need to look at this issue of capital formation and whatever. So this is very critical when it comes to investment. So you have array of reasons, array of factors and actors which explain why we are yet to maybe invest or derived benefit in the investment, particularly why Africans don't want to invest in Africa. You have proliferation of multinational companies, for example, investing heavily. For example, in Ethiopia, you talk about even the ESCO and whatever, you have many of them. So even though some scholars say that we cannot even call them multinational corporations, they are transnational corporations, because their ownership is, and control is skewed to a particular region, particularly you're talking about the West. So they are not even in technical term multinational as the name implies, but they are transnational corporations. So they have been dominating, for example, even the economy of Africa. They have invested heavily actually in Africa, and then this has its both, negative and positive maybe dimensions.
There are some teachings in Africa that political liberty is unthinkable without economic might. Then, what should Africa do to become economically self-independent?
Well, this is a very important question. As I said, there is this correlation, there is nexus between politics and economics. And some scholars say that unfortunately in Africa, politics overtakes economics in the negative sense. you have this issue of maybe even Kwame Nkrumah's view, the Sikh, the political kingdom, and all these things, this argument. Now the question is that for Africa to be economically self-dependent, right now, it means, in fact, this question even implies that Africa is not yet economically independent. So how can we, for example, become self-independent economically? Then there are a number of measures we will check in this regard. Because right now, Africa, unfortunately, is consuming what it does not produce. And this is a serious issue. We have abundant raw materials, but we don't, for example, process these raw materials. Raw materials are taken raw, as the name implies, processed elsewhere, for example, in Europe, in other parts of the world, and then bring back to us in the form of manufactured goods, and we rush to buy this. And this is very inimical, very injurious to our economy. So if you look at the trend, it's not encouraging actually. We'll look at various, for example, sectors. If we want to be self-dependent, since I said in Africa and all over the world, you have this relationship between politics and economics, then we have to look at our politics if we want to get it. I think I explained this. Then secondly, we have to look at the there are what we call three eyes of industrialization: incentives, institutions, and infrastructure. These are the three eyes of industrialization. For us to be self-dependent, we have to look at this sector. Maybe I will explain this in in detail. But before even that, look at agriculture, for example. As I mentioned this point, that Africa is a natural candidate for agricultural development. If you look at our resources, the arable land, vast arable land, more than 60% on cultivable land. So it means for us to be self-dependent, we have to look at our agriculture, look at the problems in our agricultural sector. Somebody said, for example, Taroni once said that we entered colonialism with a hoe and we came out with a hoe. Unfortunately, even after independence, we are still using these crude agricultural implements in the agricultural sector. So for us to develop, to be self-dependent, we have to mechanize our agriculture. We need agricultural mechanization, particularly now that we're in the fourth industrial revolution. Fourth industrial revolution is characterized by many developments such as artificial intelligence, cloud computing, robotics, and whatever. So there is even this notion of smart agriculture. But before we even go to that, even the traditional agriculture need to be looked at, need to be mechanized. We look at the land tenure system itself in Africa. We address the problem related to that. Then we look at other factors, the implements, agricultural implements required to effectively engage in agriculture. So if we do that, we produce what we consume. This is a very fundamental step towards becoming economically self-reliant or self-dependent. Okay, if you don't produce, what you consume, you rely on importation of what you even consume, then you have problem. So one of the important steps to be taken in this particular area is we'll look at agriculture and we'll do the needful. If you look at these various countries of Africa, they are endowed with this arable land. Many crops, for example, could be grown on the continent and whatever. So we have to address this particular problem. If we fix agriculture, as I talk about issue of politics, then we are step at least forward towards addressing our problem. Then secondly, in the decade of 1960s, there was this idea of development, in fact, was seen as synonymous with industrialization. To develop meant to industrialize. That's why many African countries embark on this industrialization, even though we know that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to industrialization, depending on historical peculiarities of a particular country. But it has been argued, it has been shown that industrialization, in fact, even these Western countries developed through normally agency of industrialization, through the vehicle of industrialization, starting from even the Industrial Revolution, which took place first in Britain and later spread to continental Europe and America. So industrialization, again, even in 21st century, is one of the important pathways to achieving economic independence. So we look at industrialization. Unfortunately, right now, our contribution, Africa's contribution to global manufacturing value added is less than 10%. So if we want to address our economic predicament, our economic problem, we have to look at our industrial sector and do the needful, because right now, Africa is virtually missing in the global industrialization equation. If we say industrialization in this context, we shouldn't even have this misconception that it means necessarily machines. You start from somewhere, okay? And some countries are doing well in this regard, are doing well maybe industrial policies and what have you. So at least if we want to be self-dependent, we have to industrialize. And industrialization, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. We look at our peculiarities and then do the needful. That's for industrialization. And then you have incentives. Okay, you say, okay, we should industrialize, we should do that. Then there is need for incentive package, a robust incentive package that will encourage even the local industries, that will encourage the peasant farmers. If we are talking about agriculture, that will encourage people to engage in, is it agriculture or local industry? So we need incentive package and whatever. Then we have institution. I'm talking about the three I's of industrialization. I talk about infrastructure, I talk about institutions, and then, okay, I talk about incentives, now institutions. We need strong institutions for us to develop, for us to industrialize, for us to even mechanize our agriculture. Unfortunately, in Africa, if you look at it, we have weak institutions. We have this argument that in Africa, we have weak institutions. You have issue of bureaucracy, for example, if you want to process these things, you want to do this, there's bureaucracy, and then you have corruption. In fact, some scholars even argue that it is almost an intellectual treason to discuss Africa's problem without looking at the issue of corruption, even though some argue that corruption is just a symptom of a larger problem. But corruption is part and parcel of our problem. We have to look at it and then address the problem squarely. So if we do that, you address the nature of your politics, you have a development-oriented politics, service-oriented politics, you have mechanized farming in place, you have industrialization, and then you have robust industrial policy. This is very important, a robust industrial policy in this regard. And even in this 21st century, there is this idea of even industries without smokestacks. Industries without smokestacks, that, okay, you can look at agriculture. There are some, maybe horticulture, some things you have maybe comparative advantage, you develop them. Okay, so in this regard, if you do that, then definitely you will develop, you will become self-dependent. You will, at least, no matter what, you will consume what you produce and then even process and then begin to export. Okay, so at least there are many things we can fix in order to address this particular of economic dependence right now.
Foreign companies like American, Asian, and European have been dominating African investments. How are these countries affecting Africa?
Historically, for example, even the first multinational company or transnational company was actually the Dutch East Indian Company. And then it was actually the first company to even issue stocks and whatever. So from there, if you look at it, these companies, you have them all over Africa. And then definitely, if you have multinational companies or transnational companies, their activities will affect the economy of their host community, and then by extension, the whole continent. If you look at issue of tax, this one area, in fact, you talk about even the corporate social responsibility. Let's start from even the positive side. Whenever you have multinational companies or companies, actually, there's this what we call corporate social responsibility. They discharge, they provide some services to their host community, to the country, and whatever, and this help in at least addressing some of the economic problems of their host community and the nation or their host country. So at least on this note, you see that these multinational companies, you have examples of, is it MTN, is it Shell, and other companies, particularly those even in the oil and gas sector. So you have them providing services in the area of education, health, and whatever. At least you have this. Then they also pay this tax to the government. Okay, they pay tax to the government, and this help in at least improving the internal generated revenue of some these African countries and whatever. So you have at least their advantages, their effects on the economy, on the society. But you have also problems like this issue of when it comes to tax, not all of them are paying the tax as required or based on the agreed maybe percentage and whatever. So you have problem of this issue of tax evasion on their part. You have issue of even non-technology transfer. You have issue of environmental degradation. For example, particularly countries, companies that engage in this issue of mining, issue of oil and gas sector. So you have issue of environmental concern regarding their activities, and which, for example, we have very good example even in the case of Nigeria, in the case of even Algeria, you have, for example, this issue. So you have environmental degradation. And then you have another issue related to this issue of multinational companies. You have issue of non-technology transfer, because ideally there should be, whenever you have multinational companies, there should be at least similar this technology transfer, so that in the near future, their host countries will also benefit from this new technology, and then it will help them towards their independent economic development or industrial development. However, you'll find out that most of these multinational companies don't engage in this issue of technology transfer in the real sense of the word. This implies that many African countries are still battling with this problem of low technology, technological base, which affects their industrialization and by extension their growth. So you have this issue of, you have the positives, you have the negatives, particularly as evident in the issue of environment, failure to pay taxes, and then issue of profit repatriation and whatever.
What does it take to change this trend, and why do Africans fail to invest in Africa?
Well, there are many reasons why actually Africans fail to invest in the continent. I think we have highlighted some of the problems of investment generally, and this could be applied to even Africans investing in Africa. Some of the problems we have examined, some maybe the hostile economic environment occasioned by insecurity. We talk about issue of civil wars, issue of crisis, issue of insurgency, and whatever. This discourage investment. And then you have issue of capital. You'll find out that maybe you have issue of capital in this regard, which actually affects investment. Even though, for example, we have some exception. Recently, even in Nigeria, we have the commissioning of one of the largest even oil refineries in the world, with the capacity of about 650,000 per barrel, okay, per day. So at least there is an improvement in this regard. And then if you look at other countries, even Ethiopia, you see pockets of private investment. But generally, you see the problems maybe outweigh the issues are many. That's why maybe you have low investment. So one of the reasons why Africans are not investing in Africa could be linked to issue of the hostile maybe economic environment. Investment climate is not healthy. We'll talk about issue of insecurity. We'll talk about issue of even capital. We'll talk about issue of infrastructure. This is very important. No investor would like to invest where you have poor infrastructure, because there is penalty of investment in an economy which has poor infrastructure. So this explains some of the reasons why Africans don't want to, are not willing actually to invest in the continent in terms of maybe knowledge, in terms of skill and whatever.
Doctor, you have mentioned some trends that are contributing to the weak investment in Africa, such as bureaucracies and conflicts in the continent. Then my question is, why do African leaders fail to address these challenges?
Well, there are many factors, particularly if you're talking about challenges of bureaucracy, challenge of conflict. Starting from bureaucracy, I think we talk about the nature of our politics. Bureaucracy, the institutions actually are very weak. And then you have issue of corruption that characterize the bureaucracy. For example, we talk about even the issue of incentive package and whatever that will encourage investment and whatever. You'll find out that in the process, there's what they call this bureaucratic rectapism. It takes time for you to get your maybe proposal scaled through, for you to get things done. And then along the way, you have issue of corruption. Perhaps you have to pay, you have to give out something for you, for your maybe file, for your proposal to pass through. So you have issue of bureaucratic process, which cause delay in the whole process. So it has many dimensions, and you have inefficiency. For example, even in the bureaucracy, you'll find out that some are not even conversant with the process, but because of the nature of our politics, because of maybe favoritism, nepotism, cronyism, which characterize our politics, you'll find out some are recruited into the state bureaucracy with no regard to issue of merit and whatever. So this also affects the whole process of investment. And then if you look at issue of conflict, conflict has many dimensions. For example, we talk about this hostile nature of the environment. If the environment is not healthy for investment, particularly you have insecurity, then you have problem. And in some instances, you'll find out that the reason why maybe African governments are finding it difficult to address issue of conflict is that perhaps some are part and parcel of the conflict. That's why you'll find out it would be very difficult. And then you have even foreign dimension, external dimension to this conflict. That's why the conflicts have become protracted. But the external factors will not be too pronounced, very prominent if you don't have what you may call internal conveyor belts of these conflicts, those that are even benefiting from this conflict entrepreneurs. For example, if you have conflict, for example, in Sudan, you have conflicts in Mali, northern Mali, and other parts of Africa, Central Africa, and whatever, you'll find out that the political establishment, the leadership is embroiled, is part and parcel of the conflict, and you have maybe foreign backing to this conflict. That's why it is very difficult to address the problem once and for all.
Africa has been fertile ground for global proxy wars for many years.
Definitely.
For how long should this trend continue?
Well, thank you very much. You know, honestly, as you rightly said, Africa has been a theater of this proxy war. If you look at even history, particularly in the post-independent period, you talk about conflict, even in the Congo, for example, the Congo crisis of 1960, 1965, you talk about the Ogaden in Ethiopia crisis between Ethiopia and Somalia. For example, this issue, territorial dispute between the two countries of 1977, 1978, you talk about even the Angolan civil war. You have even factions, those supporting movement for the liberation of Angola. You have those supporting the other one, FNLA, and other factions. So you have issue of ideological warfare, particularly between United States of America and then between the Soviet Union, and then you have the reflection of this, particularly in Africa, unfortunately, with many casualties, with many problems. So the reason why you have this issue of protracted, or this issue of proxy war, is that the colonial legacy, for example, many of these African countries, with the exception of Ethiopia, where Ethiopia was never colonized. So many of these African countries have this colonial attachment, to their Israel colonial masters. So you have problem whenever you have this issue. So you have to have this issue of global balance of power. These countries supporting this, and then in Africa you have Anglophone countries, you have Francophone countries, you have Lusophone countries, and whatever. So that's why you have this issue of proxy war. And then unfortunately, some of the rulers, for example, or leaders in Africa, have been installed by these Western countries. That's why you have this issue of proxy war all over the place. So Africa become a theater of this proxy war because it lacks even the economic muscles. Do you get the point? What I would say, economic muscles. Because even in international relations, there's what they call, there is a dictum that foreign prestige is a product of domestic strength. Unless you develop internally, you develop your economy and other things internally, you will not be respected outside. So we become vulnerable, very fragile, and then that's why these proxy wars were fought on our soil.